Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Rhonda Thorington, and I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm also a parent coach, and I have been asked to talk to you guys about grief. So, we are going to unpack grief. We are going to look at understanding it and managing grief in all its forms. So can everyone see my screen? I shared it, but I've only been on Zoom for 5 years and I still make mistakes. So I may end up muted in halfway through this presentation. So if I am, just let me know. So let's see. So before we begin, I want us to just do just a bit of housekeeping. I want to say that throughout this session, we are going to be discussing grief in its many forms, including anticipatory grief, ambiguous grief, um, other emotional challenges associated with a diagnosis of a rare disease for yourself or a loved one. So these topics may bring up difficult emotions or memories, and it's important to be mindful of how you're feeling throughout our time together. With that being said, if at any point you feel overwhelmed, it's okay to take a break. It's okay to turn off your camera, step away, and do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Your emotional well-being is the top priority, and it's okay to listen to your own limits. Actually, I would encourage it. There will also be a moment for reflection and questions at the end, should you need some additional support. Thank you for taking care of yourself and for being here today as we explore this sensitive but important topic. So thank you. So, a little bit about me. Whenever I do a presentation to a group, I always like to give a little bit of background. So, this is me and my crew, my husband and my three children at my middle daughter's high school graduation. She graduated from high school a few months ago. So, when I look at myself, there's a few things that, are integral to me. Um, One is I'm a woman of faith. I'm a wife. I'm a mom. I'm a business owner. I'm a psychotherapist and parent coach. And I'm also parent of a child with a rare disease. And one of my children was diagnosed, she got sick when she was 4.5 with a rare autoimmune disease. And that impacts every aspect of my being. So when I do these types of presentations, when I do my work as a therapist, as a parent coach, it's all informed by that. And the thing that makes me most credible in being able to speak to you about grief today is being a parent. Yeah, I've got, degrees. I've got a couple letters after my name, but the thing that makes me most credible is the fact that I've experienced all of this grief. I've walked through it and I continue to walk through it. Um, so yeah, so that's a little bit about me. So what we're going to cover today, we are going to define grief and its many forms. We are going to talk about the importance of recognizing grief. We're going to discuss practical strategies for managing grief. We're going to spend a couple minutes talking about resilience building, like what that is and why it's important. And we're also going to wrap up by moving forward with understanding and compassion. So to get started with any discussion about grief, first, let's define it. When I always go to Webster's dictionary first when I want to define any term, and this was no different. So when I looked at what grief is, the most recent Webster's dictionary definition defines grief as a deep and poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement, a cause of such suffering. And I thought, yeah, that kind of covers it. And then I decided to dig a little deeper, and I went way back to Webster's Dictionary from 1828. And I felt like that definition was a little closer to what it really is to experience grief. So, and that says the pain of mind produced by loss, misfortune, injury, or evils of any kind, sorrow, regret. When I read that definition, I thought, man, doesn't that sum up like having a rare disease, like evils of any kind? When we deal with, um, a disease that's impacting our physical body, that's an evil. It's an evil how it just um, integrates and impacts all aspects of our lives. So I thought that is a much closer definition. And then I went to the internet again, and I found another expression which I thought was spot on. And I got this off of word porn. It says grief is like living two lives. One where you pretend that everything is all right. The other is where your heart screams silently in pain. And I thought of all the definitions that I could have come across, that one is like spot on, because that really does encompass what it's like to grieve. We have our outer appearance, the self that we present to the world and others, and then we have our internal experience where we feel all of the emotions, all of the pain that our grief produces. And many times we don't feel comfortable showing the world what we're feeling like inside. So now this will look familiar to those of you who came to the session that we did on August 16th. And this connotates the stages of grief, which were developed by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And, really famous, the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. It's Dr. Kubler-Ross developed these stages as a way to help us to name our feelings and experiences inside of grief. However, what has kind of happened over the years and how we as human beings have interpreted it, because we like things to be kind of neatly in a box, is that, each stage should be followed incrementally, right? Step by step. It's like, oh, I'm done with denial. Now I'm feeling anger. Oh, once anger is done, I know I'm going to feel depressed. And then I'm going to do some bargaining. And at the end of that, then I will feel acceptance. Well, that's not the reality, right? The reality is the experience on the right, where we jump in and out of these different stages of grief at any given moment, any given time of the day, over the course of weeks. Grief is messy, and it doesn't fit into a neat little box, much, unlike what we would want it to do, is to fit in a neat box. And everyone's experience with grief is unique. We tend to grieve in a silo, right? So what my experience with grief can look very different from someone else's experience of grief. And I can experience the same loss as someone else and have it manifest differently. And the reason that that's to point out and to remember is that if your grief is manifesting differently, it doesn't mean that you're grieving wrong. It just means it's different, and that's okay. So there are different types of grief, which, I have to say, before really experiencing all of this myself, I hadn't really appreciated that. Most of the time when we consider grief, we consider traditional grief, the grief that results from a discrete event, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, an event that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's typically how we think of grief. And it doesn't have to be specifically around death, but typically when we think about grief, we do equate it to death, but um it could be around death, it could be around the loss of a career, it could be around the loss of finances, it could be, grieving the loss of, when you break up with a boyfriend, there's a grief around that. But the key to traditional grief is that it is a discrete event. Ambiguous grief, though, is when there's a loss without any boundaries. There may be a beginning, but there's no middle and there's no end. It's not due to any one event, it lacks clarity. And that's the kind of grief that many of us experience that have, a rare disease or a chronic illness. We're always in it. It's always there. It may not always be at the forefront, but it's always impacting us. So that's ambiguous grief. Anticipatory grief, well, that's grieving a potential future loss. What are you worried will happen in the future, with your health or your finances? Or if you have a loved one that has a life-limiting illness, that anticipating the loss, that's anticipatory grief. Secondary grief is to grieve other additional losses on top of the original loss. Like, for instance, if you're grieving the loss of a loved one and then there are financial losses or a financial change that happens because of that. When you, being a parent of a child with a rare disease, I've experienced loss of career. I really had to step back from my professional career in order to care for my daughter. And I have to say that secondary grief, that's the one that really threw me for a loop. I didn't anticipate that, and that's true for a lot of people. That secondary grief is often one of the most surprising and difficult to define. So now, it's also important to note that individuals can experience multiple types of grief at once, and each type brings its own challenges. I can say, for myself, that there was a time in my life where I experienced all four of these at the same time. And it was as you can imagine, it was a very, very difficult time in my life. When I had a loved one, when my daughter was, when she first got sick, I had a loved one who was also diagnosed with leukemia. And that loved one died. At the same time, my daughter was diagnosed with this rare autoimmune disease. And so when my loved one died, I experienced that traditional grief, that discrete event that I had to work through. When my daughter was diagnosed with this rare autoimmune disease that was serious and unstable at the time, that was ambiguous grief because this was our life. It had a beginning, but this thing didn't have a middle and it didn't have an end. This was going to be one day she was well and the next day she was sick. And from that point forward, we defined our lives as before the diagnosis and after the diagnosis. So I was smack in the middle of that ambiguous grief. As a result of her diagnosis, I knew that her childhood was going to be different from that of her siblings. So thinking about, and she wasn't the oldest, she was my middle child. So thinking about oh my gosh, she's not going to be able to do the same things that her brother is doing now. Her life is going to be so much different. So that anticipatory grief. And me, my daughter and I were actually talking about that last night, and thankfully she doesn't remember a lot of, the hard stuff when she was little, but I remember grieving that the loss of her friendships, knowing that if she misses so much school, her friends are going to move on without her. And so I was grieving that before it even happened. So that anticipatory grief. I mourned the loss of career, my finances, the loss of friends, the parent life that I envisioned for myself. That was that secondary grief. That was all born out of my daughter's diagnosis. So yeah, so you can see how, you can experience all these different kinds of grief all at the same time. So this infographic I got from y'all because you all put this on your website as an advertisement for this webinar. So I was like, that's awesome. So I was like, oh, I'm going to use that. And it's actually from an Instagram account called Mental Health with Emma. And I thought this is the perfect way to describe grief. Like, how does grief show up? Like, we're always, talking about grief, but what does grief actually look like? And, we think that, again, looking at like wanting things neatly in a box, we think, oh, if you're grieving, certainly you're crying, you're sad, but grief can look like many different things. Grief can look like insomnia or nightmares. I remember when my loved one died, it took forever, excuse me, for me to be able to sleep again. Brain fog or memory problems, feeling angry, resentful, or betrayed, in dealing and experiencing my own ambiguous grief. I was so angry. For me, I was angry at every parent that had a typically developing child. I was angry at, the parents trying to join with me, trying to commiserate with me, and they would try to compare, their child's cold to my little girl who was too sick to even go to school. So I was just feeling so angry. That was grief. Having intrusive memories or flashbacks. I'm sure all of us on this call have intrusive memories or flashbacks of, hospital visits or, challenging hospital stays or, conflictual interactions with medical providers, and those memories kind of just pop back into our heads and are intrusive. That can be how grief manifests. Anxiety, depression, hopelessness, loss of appetite, or binge eating. That can be, how grief can show up in our lives as well. Another way that grief can show up in our lives is, feeling everything or nothing, like being in a space where your feelings are just under the surface and any little thing can just set you off, or being in a space where nothing bothers you at all about anything, not caring about anything. That's a way that grief can show up as well. So why is this important? Well, recognizing and naming grief is the first step in addressing it. I had, when my daughter was really young, um, we had to go to the National Institutes of Health because her providers didn't know what was going on with her. And so we stayed at, it was called the Kids Inn. And we stayed with families of kids that they all had rare diseases. And we were all going through these, a week-long assessment, where we had medical appointments at the main hospital from morning till night. And at the end of that week, you meet with all of the providers in a conference, sitting around a conference table, and they give you their thoughts. And I remember it being that Thursday night. Our conference was that Friday. And I was so anxious. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't, I don't, I'm just so worried. And one of the dads of one of the other kids came up to me and he said, you know what? It's a good thing. He said, because once you name it, then you can treat it. Then you can fight it. Then you can do something about it. And that always stuck with me. So that's the reason why it's important for us to recognize and name grief. Because if we don't know what it is, we can't address it. Another reason why it's important is because unrecognized grief can lead to other things like anxiety, like depression, like dissociation, like, substance use. So that's another reason why we need to make sure that we understand what it is that we're experiencing. So the other thing that I want to make sure that everyone here understands is that it's okay to feel. Whatever it is you're feeling, it is okay. It is okay. So I remember when I had a client came to me many years ago, and she was came to me because she was grieving the death of her mother. Her and her mother were very close, and as she would talk about her mother and her illness, and her eventual passing, what I noticed is that she discussed it as if she were like two steps removed, right? As if she were describing a movie that she was watching. And so one day I asked her, I was just like, I'm curious, what you're describing these things as if you're not a part of it. And I'm curious as to why. And her response to me was she was afraid. She was afraid that if she allowed herself to feel, if she really allowed herself to get in touch with the enormity and the pain and the sadness of losing her mother, that she would never come back from it, that the pain would just swallow her up and annihilate her, and she would never be able to contain it. So I ended up spending a lot of time talking to her about all of the ways that her grief was already impacting her. She was spending so much energy trying to stuff it, trying to deny it, trying to avoid it, but her grief was already there. It was manifesting in many different ways. It was manifesting in her relationship with her husband. It was manifesting in her ability to focus at work. It was manifesting in her relationships with her friends. Even though she was trying to stuff it down, it was still coming out. When we have, those kinds of feelings, that level of intensity within us, it's not going to be ignored. It's going to come out. And oftentimes it's going to come out in ways that aren't pleasant. So, on the opposite end of the spectrum, right, is those are those folks that feel guilty about having any kind of pleasure or joy in the midst of their grief. And that's where I was, on this spectrum. When I lost my loved one, I remember this vividly. One day my husband said something like funny to me because he's quite a jokester. He always makes me laugh. And he said something funny and I laughed and I was like, and I caught myself. And in that split moment, I felt so guilty. I felt so ashamed. And my thought was, how can I laugh when my loved one isn't here? How can I any kind of pleasure when she will never breathe this air again? And I felt terrible. As human beings, we are complex individuals. And because we're complex individuals, We don't have to see things as either or, but both and. We can experience joy and sorrow. We can hold space for them both. We don't have to sacrifice one for the other. So, so I use those examples to again reiterate that it is okay to feel whatever it is that you're feeling. So, practical strategies for managing grief. Practicing mindfulness and self-compassion, being present and in the moment can help to reduce anxiety and stress and distress. Things like deep breathing or spending time in nature, things like that. So I challenge you. What we know to be true is, and I want to just put this challenge out to everybody on this call, is if you are completely present and in the moment, it is impossible to feel anxiety. Impossible. So I want to challenge you in that. If somebody, tries to be present in the moment and they're still feeling anxious, I want you to reach out to me. I want you to email me so we could talk about it. But everyone that I have ever put this challenge to has come back and said, you know what? You can't feel anxious when you are fully present in the moment. So I want to do a quick exercise. And that is, I want us to do some breathing together. We all talk about deep breathing. We all talk about diaphragmatic breathing, but a lot of times we don't actually practice it. And so I want to do an exercise right now where we're just going to take 1 minute and we're going to do some breathing together. And hopefully my video will work because we're just going to follow the video. So, okay, here we go. So this is box breathing. So what we're going to do, so if you are seated in a chair, if you are able to, put your feet flat on the floor. And what you're going to do is you're going to follow the video and you're going to breathe in for a count of 4. You're going to hold it for a count of 4, breathe out for a count of 4, and repeat that. And we're going to do that for about a minute. And then what I want us to do is I want you to pay attention to how you're feeling in your body right now. And then I want you to check in with yourself after this exercise and see how you're feeling and see if there's any change. So let's see. Okay. And this is going to be for 1 minute. So does anybody have, I know we said we would hold questions for the end, but does anybody have any want to discuss like how they felt before doing that brief exercise and after? Any thoughts?
I try to I have heard about the anxiety and being in the present.
Mm-hmm.
Um and I do try to remind myself to, because sometimes I'll notice I'm clenching my jaws. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I do practice my deep breathing or mindfulness, then it helps me really, I can feel my face relax more
Yeah.
than anything.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I don't even notice that I'm clenching my jaws. I might be working.
Mm-hmm.
And I notice my yeah. And so when I stop and then remind myself to breathe, then really the most I can feel my body relax a lot of times is in my face, especially my
Yeah.
jaws.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how just breathing can reset us. And I was doing some reading about box breathing. And the real interesting thing is that's what I think I read that that's what bomb technicians are taught to do before disarming a bomb, because it really helps you to clarify your thinking and it helps you to focus. So I thought that was interesting. It's amazing how just breathing in and out can do that. So. So another practical strategy for managing grief, setting aside time each day to just sit with our emotions. Once we accept that our emotions aren't good or bad, they just are. And, that's what we can often do is we attribute judgment to our emotions. Like, how many times do we say, oh my gosh, that's such a bad feeling. I can't believe I feel that way. Or, oh, that's such a great feeling to have. Feelings aren't good or bad. They just are. They're just feelings. Once we recognize that they just are and we understand that we can manage them, then they become less scary and less intimidating. So we can set aside time each day to sit with our emotions, and we're not looking or working to push them away because we know that whatever comes before us, we can manage. So, what does that look like practically? Well, we can take time to journal. We can talk to a therapist. We can meditate, things like that. That's how we can set aside time to just be with our emotions. Here are some sample journal prompts. I often hear from people, oh, I don't journal because I don't know what to write. Well, you can get lots of prompts so that you don't have to pull it out of thin air. You can just answer a question. So here are some prompts. When I think about my loss, I feel. Today, my body feels. Describe below your understanding of the difference between being a passive witness to your grief or an active participant in your grief. The pain, this is an interesting one. The pain of your grief will keep trying to get your attention until you have the courage to gently and in small doses embrace it. How is the pain of your grief trying to get your attention? That's an interesting one. So, and that came from the UIC counseling department, did a whole like journal about grief. Establishing emotional boundaries. That's another practical strategy for managing grief. When you're grieving, whether it's traditional grief, ambiguous grief, secondary loss, anticipatory grief, you name it, it's a time for you to be gentle with yourself and give yourself some grace. It never ceases to amaze me how hard we are on ourselves, how hard we are on ourselves when it comes to emotional challenges. If, let's say, for example, if you broke your leg, you would never put the expectation on yourself that, oh, I'm going to run this 5K, even though I broke my leg. No, you would sit down somewhere, you'd put your leg up and you'd take some medicine and you'd relax, right? But when we are in emotional pain, we just have the expectation that, oh, we just got to keep it moving. We've got to continue engaging in all of the things we engaged in before this monumental thing happened. We've got to keep up with the social engagements. We've got to keep up, work at the same pace that we did before this thing happened. And no, if you wouldn't do it with a physical trauma, you shouldn't do it with an emotional trauma. This is a time to be gentle with yourself and to give yourself grace. So, establishing emotional boundaries can also mean like limiting exposure to draining situations or individuals, protecting your emotional energy by saying no when necessary. So, and again, that's really difficult. I know that was difficult for me, certainly, early on. I was doing all of the things. Um, but there came a point where I had to just take a step back and be like, no, I'm choosing not to do this thing because I need to take care of me. So ways to build resilience. So when we look at ways to build resilience, that is, building resilience is also a way to help us to manage our grief. One of the ways to build resilience is by creating small routines that offer a level of predictability. This allows us to control the controllables. It's funny, when my daughter was, when she first became sick and I had to step way back professionally, I started baking. And it was great because, we got to, I sold cakes and, we made some extra pocket change and stuff and it helped out. But I remember saying to someone once, you know what? I can't control this awful disease that my daughter has, but I can make a mean pound cake. And I did. I made many, 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 many pound cakes. I created a routine and stability, and I was controlling the controllables. So maybe your routine is making sure that you're getting up at the same time every day. Maybe it's making sure that you're eating, at a regular time, getting exercise. We were talking about exercise before, we started, making sure that, there are certain things that you're doing every day as part of a routine. And it doesn't have to be anything big and involved, but just certain things that that you can count on each day. Because what we also know is that routine helps to create a sense of safety. Another way to build resilience is celebrating the small victories. Celebrating the small victories can help you to maintain a sense of hope. When your world is turned upside down by all of these things that are happening, celebrating small victories can, give you some light at the end of the tunnel. For example, recognizing the moments and acknowledging the moments when you didn't cry. The first time I didn't cry at the mention of my loved one's name, I was like, wow, okay, maybe I'm getting a little better here. The first time, that I was able to genuinely laugh, right? Even though I felt like incredibly guilty, I really laughed. I wasn't just going through the motions. Like that was a small victory. Being able to focus on a task that maybe you weren't able to focus on before because you were just stuck in the fog of your grief, celebrating that small victory. I remember when, for me, it was about feeling authentic again, like no longer being fake. When I smiled, it was a genuine smile. When I, found myself in a conversation with someone and I actually cared about what they were saying to me, that was a small victory for me because I was really being authentic again. You know, um, Another way that I was knew that I was kind of pulling myself out of this grief, and this is going to sound kind of silly, but when when I stopped being so hyper vigilant when it came to my daughter's labs. Like we were at the hospital all the time. She was always getting her labs drawn at least once a month, if not more often. And what I would do is I would literally sit in the parking garage and pull up the patient portal before we even left the hospital to look at her labs. And then fast forward, I remember the first time that, she had her labs drawn on a Friday, and it was like Monday night and I hadn't checked her labs. I was like, wait a minute. Wow. I I am not like freakishly being so hyper vigilant over her labs. That was a small victory. So, and that's when I knew that, okay, I'm moving through this and I'm starting to get my life back. Another way to build resilience is by nurturing connections. So remember, we discussed in our meeting in August about how isolating grief can be, and how everyone's experience with it can be so unique. How, we tend to like grieve in a silo and we tend to be so proprietary over our grief. So, because of that, the temptation is to isolate ourselves, when we're grieving. But we have to resist that because what we know to be true is that connection helps to keep us grounded during challenging times. So, and when we're grounded and when we're connected, we can heal. Support networks are also important. They help to remind us that we're not alone, not alone. And that's why, your community is so amazing because you all are there for each other and you all, just being present reminds you that you're not alone in this struggle. And the thing about support groups in particular is that you can get practical advice in real time. It's not waiting for a doctor's appointment or, reaching out on the internet. You are getting practical advice in real time. You can see examples of people who've been where you are and who may be a little further down the road on their journey. And you can see, wow, there's a path through because this person did it. There is a path forward. So that can be so empowering. Real life examples of this can be done is so empowering and resilient building. So I chose this image because this is my happy place. The beach is my absolute happy place. I could be at the beach all day, every day. I don't know how I ended up with children and a husband who don't like the beach as much as I do, but I did somehow. And so, but that's a story for a different day. Um, the beach is the place where I find peace and healing. So much so that I keep shells in my office on my windowsill. Actually, I'm looking at some right now to remind me of my own inner peace and capacity for healing. So, what I would say to you guys is know that acknowledging your own grief is the first step toward your healing. I want to challenge you to be compassionate and understanding of yourself and where you are right now. And I also want to encourage you to support yourself by identifying one action that you can implement to support your emotional health and well-being. Maybe that's committing to a guided meditation, some box breathing. Maybe that's committing to 5 minutes of journaling each day or going for a walk to spend time in nature, whatever it is, just making that commitment to one small thing that you can do for yourself for your emotional health and well-being. And remember that none of this is easy. And the things that happen to us or our loved ones often just don't make sense. So be kind to yourself, loving to yourself, and be gentle. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Rhonda, so much for doing this. That was a beautiful presentation. And as always, we really enjoy having you. I know this is a hard discussion.
Mhm. Yeah.